Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome everyone to a Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Wednesday, the 7th day of June in the year 2017. It is a pleasure to be with you on this third consecutive day we've done live programs here at the Virtual Center. I've not been able to say that for several weeks, but I think I can now, unless something untoward happens between now and the time we're off the air in a couple of hours from now. It sure is a pleasure to be with you today. I want to thank you for your continued support of our program, and also for the Head On Radio Network, for Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks who keep us on the air and keep this programming on the air and make it possible to prevent some of the kinds of broadcasting and some of the kinds of issues being raised that you really are going to get nowhere else you're not going to get it on commercial communication outlets for sure, and chances are you're probably not going to get much of it on the internet as well. I know that there are exceptions, but basically we really do believe that this is an opportunity for people to exchange opinions and discuss issues that aren't going to be discussed anywhere else. We do encourage you to take advantage of the communication opportunities available here. One of them is a phone number that will get you on the air and give you an opportunity to communicate with our other listeners throughout this country and throughout other countries as well. And again, I know that many of you appreciate the fact that we have a lot of people who pick up the phone pick up the program later on archive versions on iPods and various other things. So I do encourage you to keep that in mind. We would love to hear from you. I know our other listeners would like to hear from you as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. If you're a little bit reluctant to get on the air, but at the same time you have something you really would like to share, then please know that we would love to hear from you. And you can do that if you just drop me an email and share your thoughts with me, and I'll do the very best I can to get your ideas on the air for you. My email address is waobrien, OBRIEN 906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien 906 @gmail.com. I also encourage you to take advantage of looking at our Facebook page. There are a number of postings there. I continue to put postings on our Facebook page. I feel like it's a tremendous opportunity to get things out there for discussion in ways that we can't do any other way. I really believe that this is the potential of software, of outlets like Facebook. If you go to Facebook, facebook.com, on the homepage, you'll see a search box at the top. And if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page and a number of postings that I've put there in recent days and weeks. And of course, the most recent ones are first. And then as you scroll down, you come to postings that have been put on there a few days ago, a week ago, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. By definition, they are intended to create an opportunity for you to express comment. They are not just transmission of information per se, but what I try to do is take positions on issues. And of late, one of the things that I've been doing is putting links to pieces that I've read in various publications that I think are worthy of your time. And usually I try to include these with some commentary that I put on there, which tries to suggest some of the reasons why I think you might do well to take a look at the particular link, the particular article in question. Usually because I think it raises some questions or takes a position that you don't hear other places that are really, worth your consideration and your reflection. So again, on Facebook, just type in the search box the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you'll have access to our Facebook page. Yesterday, we spent the balance of I know most of our second hour, and in fact, some of our first hour as well, looking at some of the issues related to the political circumstances going on right now, which I think everybody is quite familiar with. I think the media is all over these issues. You may be aware that Michael Rogers and former Senator Dan Coats testified before the Senate this morning. And of course, the reports from the Washington Post have been over the last couple of days that the president had approached Coats and Rogers both and asked them if they could intercede with FBI Director Comey and see if they could get him to back off the investigation, the Russian connection or the Russian involvement in last fall's elections, and especially the investigations that the FBI was conducting on Michael Flynn. And the media, of course, interpreted this as evidence, or not evidence, but as a clear indication that the fear was that Comey and the FBI were getting awfully close to some information that might compromise the Trump administration itself, and that was the explanation of it. So the media has really created hyped the situation to the point that everybody has been looking forward all week long thus far to today's testimony by Coats and Rogers as preludes to tomorrow's testimony by former Director James Comey. I even heard this morning that bars and pubs in Washington, D.C. were opening early so that people could go in there and sit there with a drink and listen to the testimony. It's become a media event like no other. From Australia, former CIA or intelligence operator James Clapper made the comment today that Watergate pales in contrast to what's happening right now. The implication is that the house of cards that has been the 4-month-plus Trump administration is beginning to crumble. That seems to be the implication. But the latest word from Washington is that both Coats and Rogers refuse to testify on the details of conversations either of them had with the president. Coats made the comment that he was not going to do that, and that a public venue like this was not the place to do it, even if he was inclined to do it. And then both of these gentlemen concluded by stating that they had never felt that they were pressured to do anything or not to do anything by the president or by members of his administration. So that kind of took the air out of a little bit of the reality TV aspect of the news. I might say that I did hear about an hour, a little over an hour ago, I did hear Vice Chairman of the House of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Warner from Virginia, make the comment as to how disappointed he was in Coates' testimony. And he made clear to Coates that the committee was in possession of a memo which basically contradicted what he had said today, that he had never felt, had never encountered or did not recall any situation in which the White House or anybody in it was putting pressure on him to put pressure on the FBI in any way to do or not do anything. And Warner suggested that there was evidence to the contrary. So I think right now the next stage or the next step is going to be the testimony tomorrow of James Comey. And while I didn't check it out this morning, I have every reason to believe that Fox News and those outlets that do support the administration in this controversy are probably touting the Coates and Rogers appearance this morning as quite evidence that this is indeed a witch hunt and a desire by the left to take down the Trump administration and to besmirch his presidency. So I'm pretty certain that that's likely to be the direction that the conversation goes. But I haven't had the opportunity as yet to check that out. I will later. So that's kind of what we're into. It's a very, very traumatic time. I remember so well the situation in the 70s surrounding the Watergate situation. And of course, the key issue, in fact, let me say, last evening on Lawrence O'Donnell's program, The Last Word, he even played a tape, one of the Nixon tapes, which basically revealed the point at which the president gave the go-ahead to do whatever they had to do in order to stifle the investigation that was going on during the Watergate. And that particular tape, more than anything else, was the so-called the smoking gun, as it were, that caused Republican leaders to go to the White House and basically make it clear to the president that this was the end, that it was over. That's ultimately what would have to happen here, of course. And what I mean is James Clapper made the comment this morning that what was happening in Watergate itself pales in comparison to what's going on right now. What he obviously is implying is something very, very similar to the Watergate outcome is in the offing here. The fact of the matter is it's going to have to come out of Congress. And there's going to have to be some movement on the part of the Republican leadership in Congress in order for that to happen. And it's very, very uncertain. In fact, I would argue that it's very unlikely that we're going to get that kind of movement out of the Republican leadership in this Congress. This group has been hungry for power for so long that now that they've got it, they're going to hang on to it. They're going to clench their fists and dig in their heels, and they're not going to give it up easily. So I think we need to be aware of that. And again, I think the power and the influence and the steadfastness of both Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan have been evident over the last 4 or 5 days in their absence from any media coverage at all. They are virtually invisible during a period in which so much is going on around them. I think that invisibility says an awful lot. It tells us where they are ideologically and where their preferences are politically. I think there's going to have to be a lot more hard evidence than we've got right now in order for anything to move those two particular human obstacles. I'm not necessarily suggesting that there's enough evidence right now to do it. But I think the information, much of it circumstantial, we are now reaching the point when many competent people who are in the know on these kinds of issues, are now openly saying that there indeed has been obstruction of justice, not just the possibility of obstruction of justice, but they are saying definitively that there has been obstruction to an investigation coming from the White House. But again, individuals here and there saying that is not enough to make it happen. And actually, it shouldn't be enough to make it happen. Obviously, this kind of situation is extremely volatile, extremely important to the future of our nation. And ultimately, whatever happens, it needs to happen advisedly, needs to happen well, needs to happen carefully, and needs to happen legally and constitutionally. So again, I think there's an awful lot happening. I have to say, to be quite honest with you, that it is indeed an exciting time. But I don't know whether that excitement is in a positive or negative tone. I was chatting with Bob Kincaid before we came on the air for a few moments, and I kind of alerted him to an article in today's Times by Thomas Friedman, who just returned from a trip to the South Pacific. He had been to Australia, New Zealand, and several other places, and his last stop was China, and he spent a few days in China, and I guess he's now back in the United States, because the whole tone of his article this morning was, it's about China, and obviously it suggests that he had just left there. And I recommended the article to Bob for a couple of reasons. One is that Friedman makes the point that until you actually go to China and see what's happening there, you can't really believe how fast development is occurring in China. He mentions specifically a number of things that are going on, that are happening in China right now, that are way beyond where we think China is. We still look at China as a developing nation. And indeed, Friedman points out that that's been one of the bases on which China has been able to gain unfair advantage over the United States and over other nations, because in international trade agreements, China has been viewed as a developing nation that needs assistance, needs help, and needs to be free from the kinds of limitations and restrictions that these agreements placed on fully developed nations. And that China has taken advantage of that and has moved well beyond that stage of a developing nation into a highly sophisticated, highly developed entity. And Friedman lists a number of things in there that most of us, and I say most of us, I know I didn't know existed. He talks about the fast, just as an example. And this one really pains me, because I've been for a long time an advocate of putting greater resources and giving greater attention to high-speed rail service as an alternative to air service. And I've ridden many times the Amtrak on the Northeast route between Boston and Washington, D.C. And a couple of times I've ridden from Washington, D.C. through Appalachia and into the Midwest, into Chicago. For a long time, I've been an advocate of putting the necessary resources into this operation in order to make it 21st century, because I've seen it, you've read about it, I know. And that is the number of times that the whole system breaks down, that the system needs a lot of work and a lot of attention. It's not nearly what it could be. Friedman, in his piece this morning, makes reference to the fact that every single day, China operates 60 trains per day, high-speed trains between Beijing and Shanghai, traveling at 300 kilometers per hour. Folks, 300 kilometers per hour is pretty fast. These 60 trains a day carry enough cars to transport approximately 1,300 people on each train, back and forth between Shanghai and Beijing every single day. Also, Friedman makes the point that China is taking the lead in robotics, in renewable energy, in electric automobiles, in investing in the future of renewable energy. Also, that China is actively engaged in entering into partnerships with European nations like Germany. The implication, of course, is that the United States not only is out of the loop, but obviously President Trump has taken us off the table. And there's very little in this coverage that Friedman gives us to even indicate that the United States is even a player any longer in this operation. The message that Friedman gives us is pretty clear. Yes, China has had an advantage. Yes, it's been an unfair advantage. But the reality is we've got ground to make up, and we better start doing it. And the way we're acting and the positions we're taking are not conducive to closing that gap. I think it's a pretty powerful article. It's powerful for some of the specific things that China is doing. One of the things is the moneyless or the currency-less exchange. That China is way ahead of us in eliminating hard currency in order to do business. More and more of business in China is conducted with mobile phones. We talk about it here in this country. They're doing it. And they're talking about the fact that business is booming in mobile phone on mobile phones in China. At the same time, we realized, Bob was making this point, that China is in a position where they really can do nothing else because they've got a population to feed, which is an incredible challenge. And indeed, all of that is true. But again, I think that's what that's kind of one of the things that I think we're going to need to have to pay much more attention to than we have. So the point of the situation, that's kind of a rundown of some of the perspective that the national media is taking on over the last couple of days. I don't think there's anything there that anyone doesn't know. I think if by definition the people who regularly listen to a program like this are very, very much up on the news, so to speak, and know pretty much what's going on. So I probably haven't said a whole lot up to this point that's worthy of reflection or comment or anything else. But in our second hour yesterday, I was focusing on yet another aspect of what's going on in Washington right now, as far as the White House, the Russian investigation, the termination of James Comey as a FBI director, and many of the other things that are going on associated with it. If you'll recall, on yesterday's program, I didn't really do a whole lot with the obstruction of justice issue, but I think that a lot's happening there. The issue that I wanted to focus on, and the issue that we spent some time on yesterday, related to freedom of the press. And that's the direction that I've been taking our attention, because I think it's particularly significant for a number of different reasons. One of which is that it pertains directly to the issues related to the Constitution of the United States. As such, it seems to be germane to the mission of a program like this, the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution. I also believe it's significant because, as we know, and I said this yesterday, President Trump has made it a point during the campaign and since he took office to take issue with media criticism. He has engaged in open battle with the media. He's referred to the media as an enemy of the people. He's demeaned the role of the media in our political system. He's challenged those in Washington who continue to leak information to the media. He's challenging the media's right to gain access to such information. Basically, what he's doing is challenging the right of the media to do its job, which is to inform the American people so that the American people can adequately assess the performance of their elected representatives. That's the role for the media in a democratic republic like ours. That's the role that the founders appreciated from the very beginning had to be there. That's why freedom of the press has a prominent part in the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. That's the reason that Congress, in proposing amendments to the Constitution, made freedom of the press a priority, along with what they called at that time freedom of conscience. These were critical freedoms to the successful operation of our political system. And there's absolutely no question in my mind that President Trump's attack on the media is an attack on the legitimate constitutional function of a free press in this society, because it makes it impossible for the media to do its job. It is intended, it is behavior on the part of the administration to obfuscate, to divert, to hide, to out and out lie in some cases. The outcome of which is to confuse and befuddle the American people and make it impossible for the people to become informed. And our entire political system revolves around its dependency on the participation of an informed electorate. This has serious constitutional implications, I would suggest. Last evening, I spent quite a bit of time. In fact, yesterday I mentioned that I had spent some time, but not a whole lot of time, doing some research on some Supreme Court cases in which the importance of the media, of a free press, played a significant role. We talked yesterday specifically about the case of Neer versus Minnesota, the 1931 case, which really nailed down or validated the court's strong opposition to the idea of censorship or prior restraint on the press as violating the very basics of the press's role in the operation of our political system. Last evening, I took up the research on this particular question. I was very in looking at some of the issues, the considerations have been expressed by those who know a role that the media plays. Significant focus issue of the Trump administration's threat to the idea of a free press, knowing that freedom of the press, the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, then I was flirting with very serious, and I needed some backup. I needed some validity or some validation, some affirmation for my own mind that I was on. Again, I wasn't going in there of what the free press is about in our political system. I think I have a very good idea, but I didn't want to be the only one to say it. I wanted to get some backup so that other prominent people in the know could validate my concern. And I found it. And I wanted to share a little bit of that with you on today's program, if you'll bear with me. If you go on the internet and you do serious questioning about the founders and a free press, where you're going to land right at the beginning is the first time under the Constitution of the United States that the issue of freedom of the press became significant. And that's at the end of the 18th century, in the 1798 passage by the Federalist Congress of the very famous Alien and Sedition Acts. And you'll recall that these were pieces of restrictive legislation passed by a Federalist-dominated Congress for political purposes. The intent was to stifle criticism of the Federalist-controlled government. More specifically, it was to cast negative aspersions on the emerging Republican opposition to the Federalists that had taken shape in the House of Representatives, principally under the leadership of James Madison. Clearly, there was an effort, and we know that from the very beginning, Alexander Hamilton was a leading architect of this effort. From the very beginning, there was an effort to portray critics of the administration as enemies to the nation. In the early years under the Constitution, the emphasis was on the danger of parties. The criticism was criticism of the emerging Republican opposition within the House to the policies and programs of the Washington administration under the tutelage of Secretary, most specifically to Hamilton's financial program, taxation and economic stimulation and development that Hamilton believed was necessary to stimulate and grow the economy of the new nation in order to make it competitive to the existing nations in the Western world. The other priority of Hamilton was based on international affairs, and that was to move this nation into closer proximity with Great Britain, to try to overcome some of the suspicion and some of the negativism toward the British, because Hamilton recognized that Britain as the major commercial nation in the world, with the most extensive colonial system in the world, it was very obvious to him that a developing nation like the United States needed the kind of commercial opportunities and access that good relations with Britain would deliver to us. That opposition to Great Britain was part of the organ. Madison and the other leaders of the Republican opposition were basically looking at the financial program of Hamilton on the one hand and the diplomatic initiatives of the Hamilton priorities on the other as evidences of emerging elitism in this country, suggesting that the priorities of the government in being directed to better relations, better commercial relations with Britain, were basically taking the venues of America's political system and putting them at the feet of commercial and banking and financial elites. That government's policies under President Washington were being directed to providing inordinate benefits to big money, to the North and Northeast, to emerging industry, to emerging financial institutions, to growing commercial institutions who were looking for the economic development and profit opportunities associated with better relationships with Britain. The Republicans, on the other hand, believed that America's very independence owed a tremendous debt of gratitude to France, and that America's diplomatic priorities ought to be toward assisting and supporting the French rather than the British. And these diplomatic differences, taking sides, if you will, in the ongoing struggle for world dominance between Great Britain and France, ultimately shaped the emergence of two-party development in this country through the 90s. And during the presidency of John Adams, in the last 4 years of the 18th century, the Federalists undertook to use the media as a way to administer permanent damage to the Republican opposition, and were able to get through the Federalist-dominated Congress the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act basically gave the President of the United States tremendous flexibility and leverage to oust foreigners in this country that the government believed posed a threat to the priorities and to the government of this nation. The Sedition Act made it a violation of law under penalty of doing prison time for criticizing the government, criticizing the policies of the government, criticizing the President of the United States. In other words, the Sedition Act censored the press, censored free speech, censored the media from publishing anything that was derogatory toward the government or toward its policies and priorities. The Alien and Sedition Acts posed a direct challenge to the Constitution of the United States and to clear violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. In Virginia, James Madison was instrumental in getting through the Virginia legislature a series of resolutions taking issue with the constitutionality and the legality of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And if you go online and set out to do some research on the issue of a free press in America, there's no question that this is the particular period you're going to land on first. This is the particular issue that comes up first, namely Virginia's resolutions against the Alien and Sedition Acts. I spent last evening reading them. They are extensive. The backup information in them and on them is extensive. Madison is at his best in explaining why these particular pieces of legislation, the Alien and Sedition Acts, threaten the Constitution of the United States, threaten the rights of citizens, threaten the very operation of our political system. Let me share with you the pertinent paragraph in which Madison addresses each of these. The citation for these are the Virginia Resolutions of 1798, James Madison. This particular resolution adopted the day before Christmas, December 24th, 1798. Here's what Madison writes: that the General Assembly, the Virginia General Assembly, doth particularly protest against the palpable and alarming infractions of the Constitution in the two late cases of the Alien and Sedition Acts passed at the last session of Congress. The first, the Alien Act, the first of which exercises a power where exercises a power nowhere delegated to the federal government, and which by uniting legislative and judicial powers to those of the executive subverts the general principles of free government, as well as the particular organization and positive provisions of the federal Constitution. At this point, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that particular issue, except to point out something very significant. What Madison is saying here is the particular threat to the Constitution that the Alien Act poses is that it gives the executive, gives the president, so much power under the heading, under the cover, if you will, of protecting the security of the United States, that it combines legislative and judicial power with the executive power. In other words, it violates the separation of power principles on which the Constitution is based. And that's Madison's point. In our program yesterday, that was my point about President Trump and his refusal to accept the right of the court to suspend operation of his travel ban. And in the tweet, the fifth of 5 tweets that he released Monday morning, 2 days ago, President Trump said that in spite of the court's ruling that the travel ban cannot and ought not to go into effect because it's unconstitutional, in spite of that, the president says, we are undertaking what he called extreme vetting in the interests of protecting the security of this country. And then he closes the tweet by saying, because our court systems is so political and so slow. What President Trump is admitting in that particular tweet is that he is violating the ruling of the court on the travel ban. While it is being appealed to the Supreme Court, he has made the decision that his travel ban will be implemented, even though the court said that he can't do it. He has taken power away from the courts. He's flaunting the right of the courts to interpret the law, to interpret the Constitution of the United States, which means he's operating contrary to the rule of law. He is violating separation of powers. He is violating the Constitution of the United States. And James Madison says that in the Virginia Resolutions of 1798 exactly. That's Madison's point about the Alien Acts. Then he goes on to the Sedition Act. The other of which acts, the Sedition Acts, exercises in like manner, Madison says, a power not delegated by the Constitution, but on the contrary, expressly and positively forbidden by one of the amendments thereto. Not only does the Constitution not give government the power to censor the press, but more specifically, there is an amendment to the Constitution, Amendment number 1, which specifically, expressly, and positively forbids the government from doing that. In spite of that, Madison says, Congress passed the Sedition Acts, even though it was in clear violation of the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Madison goes on. A power which more than any other ought to produce universal alarm, because it is leveled against the right of freely examining public characters and measures, and of free communication among the people thereon, which has ever been justly deemed the only effectual guardian of every other right, unquote. Madison is saying that the freedom of the press has been deemed the only effective guardian of every other right in the Constitution. If people are denied access to information, if people are denied the opportunity to become informed, then our government can't function. because the people cannot examine what Madison calls public characters and measures. People cannot evaluate and hold accountable their elected officials. They don't have the basis on which to evaluate the policies and programs that their elected officials are enacting. By remaining uninformed, they become ignorant, which means the people cannot perform the legitimate duties assigned them in a democratic republic. And every other right that citizens have in this republic stem from this one. If citizens can't fulfill the role that the Constitution assigns them, then our political system can't function, and all the other rights become mute, become null and void. Let me add one more comment from Madison on a free press. This one comes 23 years later. In a letter to W.T. Barry in 1822, long after Madison has retired from political office. And this is a quote that I've used many times here on the Virtual Center. It relates to the role of informed citizens. A popular government, Madison says, without popular information or the means of acquiring it, is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives, unquote. Madison's position on the role of the free press and related to it, the idea of freedom of speech, is critical. Speech and press together are the key ingredients in people performing their constitutional functions in this democratic republic. Says James Madison, the architect of our Constitution. That, it seems to me, speaks volumes about the issue. Let me go back to the 18th century once again, to the Alien and Sedition Acts, to Madison's position on freedom of the press. There's no question that from the very beginning, censorship, what we called and what the court calls in Neer versus Minnesota, prior restraint, from the very beginning is a given. But this raises the question, does government have no authority, no power in a contest with the press? Is the press free to say anything it wants about anything, and government doesn't have the right to do anything about it? Obviously, there are people who question that. In the 18th century, the Federalists questioned that. And one of the leading Federalists who questions that is a congressman from Virginia named John Marshall, who's going to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court under Thomas Jefferson in 1803. Marshall is a Federalist in Congress. And Marshall raises the questions about the First Amendment's limitations on government. He questions the seemingly absolute right of free press and free speech. Marshall argued that the free press guarantee means only liberty, and this is a quote, liberty to publish free from previous restraint, free of requirements about licensing, or that material be approved before it's published. Marshall's willing to accept that as a key ingredient of the First Amendment. He's right in tune with Blackstone in Britain and the idea from British common law. That is, that criminal punishment after publication is constitutional. In other words, Marshall is willing to accept that you can't censor publication beforehand, but you can damn well sue people after they publish it for what they said. Press isn't that free. That has been a debate ever since. Madison questions that. He argues just the opposite. And this is what Madison says on this question. And this is a quote. This idea of the freedom of the press can never be admitted to be the American idea of it. He's talking about Blackstone. He's talking about the right for criminal punishment after publication. Madison said that may work in Great Britain, but it can't work here. Since a law inflicting penalties on printed publications would have a similar effect with a law authorizing a previous restraint on them, unquote. In other words, what Madison is saying is that the threat of criminal punishment after I write something is enough of a threat to keep me from writing it. It constitutes restraint. So this back and forth debate has been ongoing ever since. In the history of our legal jurisprudence, in the history of the Supreme Court, there has been no defender of free speech and free press more outspoken than Hugo Black. Let me share Hugo Black for a minute. This is the case, 1966, Mills versus Alabama. It's a case which revolved around the constitutionality of an Alabama law called the Alabama Corrupt Practices Act, which provided criminal penalties for publishing editorials which were considered to be violations excuse me, of the First Amendment. This is what Hugo Black says about the freedom of the press. Quote, The Constitution specifically selected the press, which includes not only the newspapers, books, and magazines, but also humble leaflets and circulars, to play an important role in the discussion of public affairs. Thus, the press serves, and was designed to serve, as a powerful antidote to any abuses of power by government officials, and as a constitutional keeping officials elected by the people responsible to all the people whom they were selected to serve. Of the right of the press to praise and to clamor and contend for change, which is all that this editorial did. Every one of the agencies of the framers of the Constitution thoughtfully and the Alabama Corrupt Practices Act by providing criminal publishing editorials such as the one it can be most effective. It is difficult to conceive of a more obvious and flagrant abridgment of the constitutionally guaranteed freedom of the press. Later, Hugo Black says, in New York Times versus United States, 1971, this is where the court ruled on the New York Times. Hugo Black said in that decision, in the First Amendment, the Founding Fathers gave the free press the protection it must have to fulfill its central role in our democracy. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors. The government's power to censor the press was abolished so that it could bear the secrets, was abolished so that the press would remain forever free to censure the government. The press was protected so that it could bear the secrets of government and inform the people, unquote. Hugo Black, New York Times versus United States, 1971. Black is one of the most outspoken proponents of absolute freedom of speech and of the press. Let's go back once again to John Marshall and to the Federalists in 1798. And I know we're four minutes or so beyond the top of the hour. Let me share with you this quote from Marshall, and then we'll pause and take our break. Quote, Marshall and other Federalists argued that freedom of the press must necessarily be limited because, quote, government cannot be secured if by falsehood and malicious slander it is to be deprived of the confidence and affection of the people, unquote. In other words, Marshall is saying, the Federalists were saying, there has to be limit to the freedom of the press. People have to be limited in what they can say about the government, because they could create such a negative image of government that the people would never support government in anything. And we can't allow that to happen. So what Marshall and the Federalists are saying is we're willing to accept the issue of prior restraint, but we're not willing to accept the fact that freedom of speech and freedom of the press are absolute rights that give people the right to say anything they want about anything or anybody. We can't go that far. Not so, said James Madison. Even speech, Madison says, that creates a contempt, a disrepute, or a hatred of the government among the people must be tolerated, because the only way of determining whether such contempt is justified is by a free examination of the government's actions and a free communication among the people thereon. What Madison is saying is The only way to determine whether freedom of the press and free speech have been abused is by what happens in the free exchange and discussion that follows. In other words, in the marketplace of ideas. Basically, then, the key position is that judges do not have the authority to limit free speech. Only the results of the free exchange of ideas in the marketplace can do that. Because when you start to impose governmental limits on free speech and a free press, you begin to move awfully close to the issue of prior restraint. That's the issue. I think it's very, very significant. I think we're on the edge right now of a situation which raises that question once again. Because President Trump obviously has decided to take on the courts over his travel ban. And I think that's kind of what we're facing right now. Basically, what President Trump is saying is we've got to find ways to keep the press from getting access to information that we don't want out there. And the architects of our Constitution have said that the role of the press is to get hold of that information in order to make sure that citizens are informed. That's the issue. I think it's the most important issue in this whole discussion and debate that's going on right now. But we'll see. We're going to pause now. It's 9 minutes after the hour. We'll pause for 4 or 5 minutes. And then we'll come back and we'll do the last 45 minutes of our program. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is June 7th in the year 2017. We're going to take a short 5-minute break. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our second hour, everyone. I want to welcome Agnes because we had Bob at the top of the hour in our first hour. And I didn't know Agnes was there until just now. So welcome, and she had commented on the chat line that that if you limit free speech, you would make it very difficult for any kind of a proper defense within the legal system as well. And of course, I think that's a point. That's another point that I think is well taken in this issue. We're really into something. This is a real thicket, of course. And the reason that it's important is because I think we need to think about these things as we watch what's happening in Washington unfold. As the president continues to dig in his heels against the courts and the court's right to validate or invalidate the travel ban, as they weigh its consistency with the Constitution of the United States, which is their job. When the president implies that he's not accepting their conclusion and plans to go ahead anyway, pending the appeal at the hearing at the Supreme Court, he is obviously questioning the right of the Supreme Court, of the judiciary, to interpret the law, to say what the law is, as John Marshall said when he was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. We all remember, and I know that I had a conversation with Bob some weeks ago, and he reminded me of this particular situation again, when Andrew Jackson, when he was president, took on John Marshall in a decision that Marshall rendered against the Jackson administration on the issue of Indian rights in what then was the Southwest, and of course this opened up the region to settlers and involved the movement of Native Americans across the into the West and across the Mississippi in the famous Trail of Tears situation. But if you recall, Marshall made a ruling that the Indian claim, the Cherokee claim to that land, was consistent with the Constitution of the United States. And Andrew Jackson made the very famous response, Justice Marshall has made his decision, let us see him enforce it. And of course, what he was pointing out was the fact that the court can say what it wants about what the law is, but ultimately enforcement power is in the executive branch. And what Jackson was saying is, I choose to not enforce the court's decision on this particular case. And in effect, that's what Donald Trump is saying right now on the travel ban. That's where I think the relevance comes. This is really relevant to what's happening right now, it seems to me. We're into our second hour here at the Virtual Center on this Wednesday. Today is the 7th day of June in the year 2017. It's now 19 minutes after the hour, so we've got better than a full half hour to go in our program today, in our program this week, because this is our last time together for this week until we get back together again next Monday. Let me invite you to participate in this discussion by picking up the phone and giving us a call at area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate one-on-one with me that way, is waobrien906 at gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906 at gmail.com. And again, I do remind you to take advantage of our Facebook page. There's a number of different ways that you can comment on the postings that are there. I encourage you to do that. They are primarily there for, to raise these issues with you. It gives me an opportunity to communicate directly with you, and it gives you the opportunity to communicate directly back. That's really the benefit of this. I do not for a moment take lightly the opportunities that it provides me to post my own thoughts about some of these things. It's an opportunity to vent. It's an opportunity to communicate with a lot of people at the same time and say, hey, you won't believe what I just read. Take a look at this one and see what you think. Here's what I think. Let's face it, that's an important opportunity. I don't take that lightly for one moment. So again, I really do solicit and value, cherish the opportunity for us to communicate. And I hope you'll take advantage of that. There are a lot of places in the world where people don't have that right. We were into the issues related to freedom of the press and the debate over it. And the two issues we were talking about were, on the one hand, the question of prior restraint, censorship, the ability of government to control what's published about it and about its policies. And going back to the 1898 debate over the Alien and Sedition Acts, Madison and John Marshall agreed. Republicans and Federalists were in agreement that the First Amendment protected citizens against prior restraint. But where Marshall and Madison differed was over the question of the extent of these First Amendment freedoms. The question being, does government have no right to limit at all what people say and publish about it. And of course, Marshall's argument in that situation is if we don't limit that right, then people or publications can say and do what they want to so belittle, so demean the reputation and the operation of government that it literally becomes inoperable. You've got to give government the opportunity to defend itself, is what Marshall is saying. And of course, what Madison says is that it's the free exchange of ideas that determines the appropriateness or lack of appropriateness associated with these First Amendment freedoms. Let me go for validation of that particular question back to the Supreme Court. Two cases. New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964. I have a kind of a warm feeling about that case. If you'll permit me, let me just go on a tangent for a moment and tell you why. One of my best friends, an absolutely brilliant colleague, former graduate student with me at the University of Wisconsin, a scholar of early American colonial history that has made numerous appearances here in southern West Virginia with me during the history grants that I had over the last since 2003. From 2003 to 2009, I had two very substantial grants. So for 6 years straight, we were in the process of administering these grants, graduate classes, to teachers, to history teachers. And my friend Bob Bliss, who teaches history at the University of Missouri in St. Louis, and up until last year was dean of the Honors College there, joined me. Bob and I have been friends since I first went to graduate school in 1965. We've been colleagues and friends that long. The reason New York Times versus Sullivan has a warm spot in my heart is because when I first met Bob in the 1960s, in the mid-60s, Bob's dad, who was a professor of journalism at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, was defending his dissertation on the case of New York Times versus Sullivan. And Bob gave me the honor, and I mean that, in the 1960s, of reading his dad's dissertation, which was based on the New York Times versus Sullivan case. So every time I see mention of that case, it was a case related principally to Dr. Martin Luther King and the Birmingham demonstrations. I have a very warm place for that. Anyway, in that case, also in the 1974 case of Gertz versus Robert Welsh, the court rendered the following conclusion, quote, "Under the First Amendment, there is no such thing as a false idea. However pernicious an opinion may seem, we depend for its correction not on the conscience of judges and juries, but on the competition of other ideas," unquote. So the courts in those two cases found for the side of freedoms, the First Amendment freedoms, and chose to limit powers of government in those particular cases. Let me share with you a couple of other quotes that I found during my research last night on freedom of the press. I think they're very informative and very significant. And they do fit here. So if you'll permit me, let me just share a couple of them with you. This is a paragraph written in 1765 by John Adams. John Adams, as we know, was not only a second president of the United States, but he was prominent in the oncoming of the American Revolution. He was a noted attorney in the Boston area, and many of you may not know that he defended the British troops in the Boston Massacre and got them off. And for that, he had to weather an awful lot of opposition, including from his cousin Sam Adams. There was a brilliant series done at the time of the bicentennial in the 1970s called The Adams Chronicles. And in that, there's this wonderful exchange between Sam Adams and John right at the end of the trial, when the court rules in favor of Adams and in favor of the British soldiers. And then the scene shifts to the hallway outside the courtroom. And John and Sam are having this discussion, and Sam is criticizing John Adams for defending the British troops. And John said to Sam, "Sam, the only thing I was doing was giving these British soldiers their legitimate rights. I was defending their rights to a trial, to come to court and make their case." And Sam Adams says, "I understand that, John, but did you have to do it so damn well?" It's a brilliant exchange. But anyway, this is John Adams in a publication that appeared in 1765 called A Dissertation on the Canon and Feudal Law. And in it, Adams is talking about this particular topic. And this is what he says. "Liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people, who have a right from the frame of their nature to knowledge, as their great Creator, who does nothing in vain, has given them understandings and a desire to know." I mean, I think this is just absolutely delicious stuff. What John Adams is saying is that the Creator gave man the ability to think, understand, and reason. And the Creator doesn't do anything in vain. He must have had a purpose. Therefore, liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people, who have a right because they have the ability to know and understand. They have a right to know. They have a desire to know. Besides this, Adams says, they have a right, an indisputable, unalienable, indefeasible, divine right to that most dreaded and envied kinds of knowledge. I mean, of the characters and conduct of their rulers. They have a right to know what those who govern them are doing, are about. Rulers are no more than attorneys, agents, and trustees of the people. And if the cause, the interest, and trust is insidiously betrayed or wantonly trifled away, the people have a right to revoke the authority that they themselves have deputed and to constitute other and better agents, attorneys, and trustees. And then there's this absolutely delightful statement from Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is the philosopher. This is an interview done in 1974 in the New York Review of Books with a French writer, Roger, 26 October 1978. And this is what Hannah Arendt says about freedom of the press. The moment we no longer have a free press, anything can happen. What makes it possible for a totalitarian or any other dictatorship to rule is that people are not informed. How can you have an opinion if you're not informed? If everybody always lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. This is because lies, by their very nature, have to be changed, and a lying government has constantly to rewrite its own history. On the receiving end, you get not only one lie, a lie which you could go on for the rest of your days, but you get a great number of lies, depending on how the political wind blows. And a people that no longer can believe anything cannot make up its mind. It is deprived not only of its capacity to act, but also of its capacity to think and to judge. And with such a people, you can then do what you please, unquote. That particular quote is very relevant to what we've been dealing with here over the last several months on the issue of alternative facts and fake news. This related to the administration. I'm thinking specifically here of one Kelly, who was the one that made the very dubious facts. Basically, the position that Hannah Arendt is suggesting here is to you. By definition, one lie leads to another lie leads to another lie. They have to come up with new lies, reinforce the previous ones. The result is not the lies, but that people get to the point where they don't believe anything. And once they get to that point, then they can't reason, they can't judge. And once they reach that point, you can do with them. And that's the danger that comes to a free press, says Hannah Arendt. 1774, on the 26th of October, 1774, the Continental Congress, prior to the Declaration of Independence, if you remember, was engaged in a campaign to try to draw Canada away from the British Empire. And as part of that initiative, in a letter sent by the Continental Congress to the inhabitants of Quebec, Canada, this is in the journals of the Continental Congress, which I have on my shelf here in my study. The Continental Congress writes the following, quote, "The last right we shall mention regards freedom of the press. The importance of this consists, besides the advancement of truth, science, morality, and arts in general, in its diffusion of liberal sentiments on the administration of government, its ready communication of thoughts between subjects, and its consequential promotion of union among them, whereby oppressive officers are shamed or intimidated into more honorable and just modes of conducting affairs." What the Continental Congress is telling the people of Quebec is that the reason we so value freedom of the press is because it's the ability of the people to know what elected leaders are doing that keeps elected leaders on the right path and make sure they'll do the right thing because they'll know the people are watching. That's the value of a free press. And then finally, in a speech delivered to the National Conference on Media Reform on the 15th of May, 2005, Bill Moyers was speaking to journalists on media reform. And this is what he says about a free press. Think about this in terms of some of the things that are going on in today's political world. Quote, "A free press is one where it's okay to state the conclusion you're led to by the evidence. One reason I'm in hot water is because my colleagues and I at Now, and you remember he had this TV program called Now, didn't play by the conventional rules of Beltway journalism. Those rules divide the world into Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, and allow journalists to pretend they've done their job if instead of reporting the truth behind the news, they merely give each side an opportunity to spin the news. Unquote. What Bill Moyers is suggesting, 2005, is that the reason we need media reform is because our major parties have fallen into the political split between Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives. And they have become outlets for particular ideological points of view than they're supposed to be sources of real news. Instead of getting behind and seeking out the truth behind the news, they've become mouthpieces for one or the other political party or ideological position. And they're defending themselves by claiming that they've done their job. They haven't done their job, Bill Moyers is saying. We were doing that job, and that's why we kept getting into hot water with so many of our colleagues. I think there we have a pretty good overview, going back through history, as to what most of the relevant issues were related to issues on freedom of the press. So the question we have to consider is President Trump's position vis-a-vis the courts and his travel ban. On this past Monday, June 5th, in a series of 5 separate tweets on the travel ban and on the courts, these tweets, you'll recall, are what has gotten Donald Trump in trouble because they were in response to the terrorist attack Saturday night in London. Many people believed that Trump's priority should have been to express sympathy and empathy with the British people and with the mayor of London, not taking him on and criticizing him for being soft on terrorism and not using the opportunity provided by the terror attack to promote his travel ban, which is exactly what he did. That was the principal media focus of this tweet storm that occurred on Monday morning. But the fifth one, the last one, is the one that I would like to focus on. That's the one that I have been focusing on. And here's exactly what he said in that tweet, quote, "In any event, we are extreme vetting," capitals, capital letters, extreme vetting, people coming into the United States in order to help keep our country safe. The courts are slow and political, unquote. There are two issues here. One is extreme vetting, what exactly that means. But I would suggest that a key phrase or key portion of that particular tweet is in the first 3 words. In any event. This is what we're doing. If you say in any event, in this particular situation, you are saying we don't care what the courts have said, this is what we're doing. I would suggest that that itself raises serious constitutional questions. It challenges the rights of the court to rule on the constitutionality of legislation and proposed legislation. It violates separation of powers. It challenges none other than James Madison himself when he criticizes those who advocate the Alien Acts of 1798. Madison said, the General Assembly here in Virginia, the General Assembly doth particularly protest against the palpable, alarming infractions of the Constitution in the two late cases of the Alien and Sedition Acts passed at the last session of Congress. The first, the Alien Act, first of which exercises a power where exercises a power nowhere delegated to the federal government, and which by uniting legislative and judicial powers to those of the executive subverts the general principles of the government, as well as the particular organization and positive provisions of the federal Constitution. What Madison is saying there is that what Donald Trump tweeted on Monday about extreme vetting violates the Constitution in the same way as did the Alien Act of 1798. Violates separation of powers, and it assumes a power that the Constitution of the United States does not delegate to the president. The only commentator or columnist to mention this that I've seen was Eugene Robinson in the Washington Post. And so I posted the link to Gene Robinson's article in which I wrote this particular posting and put it on Facebook. And my point is that it's really significant when somebody like Eugene Robinson, I don't know how many people know Eugene Robinson. He's a prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post. He's been there for years. He's one of the most reputed, respected columnists on the world stage today. He's not a radical. He's not a conservative either. I would suggest he's probably what we would call a moderate. But in his columns, he's taken to saying things about some of the behavior coming out of the White House that really are out of place for him. He's taken, as I've said, he's taken criticism of this president to extremes he's never dared enter before. I've said, imagine somebody with his reputation, with his resume, making statements like, and this comes directly from this particular article, that the president is, quote, out of control, which is the title of his article. That the president has, quote, come off the rails in his criticism of the mayor of London. And then his conclusion about Donald Trump. And this is a quote. This is the final line of his article. We already knew that Trump had a narrow mind and a small heart. Now we must wonder about his emotional stability, his grasp of reality, or both. Coming from Eugene Robinson, I felt that this is pretty powerful stuff. I have to tell you that in this article, Gene Robinson is the only one that draws special attention to the fifth of the 5 tweets that come out of the White House on this past Monday morning, because of the hard stand that the president is taking against the courts. That, I think, may be the most significant of all 5 of the tweets. But that's debatable. That's minor. That's just my view. But in light of what the Constitution says about separation of powers, what the First Amendment says and means about free speech, I think we're dealing with a situation here that really demands some serious reflection and some serious attention. We are now at 11 minutes before the end of our program. And I'm a little bit angry at myself because I have another issue that I really wanted to address today. I think I can probably introduce it because I think it's that significant. But I think it's an issue we'll probably have to hold until next week's programs in order to flesh out. It's a very important issue. It deals with the Republican Party. It deals with the whole issue of conservatism. Most specifically, it deals with the extent to which the leadership of the Republican Party and the definition of conservatism have parted ways, and whether in fact it's going to be possible to bring them back together again. Humpty Dumpty has fallen off the wall and has shattered to the right of center. And the question is whether in fact it's going to be possible to put the pieces back together again. A leading spokesman for doing this is columnist George Will. George Will, as many of you may know, has long been one of the most reputable conservative commentators in the nation. He's prize winner. He's well respected. He is a little bit wordy. He kind of plays with the language a little bit. He commits the sin that those people who write. I heard an interview on C-SPAN, I think over the weekend, with John Grisham, the author John Grisham, who continues to crank out mystery after murder mystery after murder mystery that are bestsellers. I think the mention on during the interview, I think it was mentioned that Grisham has sold something in excess of 300 million copies of his books. So success and John Grisham go hand in hand in terms of the world of books. Anyway, John Grisham was being interviewed on C-SPAN about writing, about how writers ought to proceed, what he has learned about writing. And one of the things that John Grisham said was that if you are going to do serious writing, you don't want to do it with a thesaurus within reach, because your inclination is going to be to use a better sounding, more highfalutin word than the one you're using. And too much of that is going to take you out of communication with your readers. So his advice is, don't write with a thesaurus anywhere near you. The reason I say that is because if you are a regular reader of George Will's columns, you are seeing the direct opposite. You are dealing in George Will with a writer who always has a thesaurus right at his elbow. If you've read his columns, you'll know pretty much what I mean. On May 31st, which was, again, a week ago, George Will wrote a column on William Buckley. Most significantly, it was a column crediting William Buckley with the birth of modern conservatism. I want to read the first paragraph. I don't have much time to do any more than that. I want to share with you the first paragraph of Buckley's article. Of George Will's article. But it might be, in preparation for Monday, a good idea to go online. Just go to the Washington Post. Go to the opinion section. And then just click on the link to columnists. And you'll see George Will's name there. And if you just click it, you'll get access to this particular article by George Will, which was written on May 31st. And this is the first paragraph. In 1950, the year before William F. Buckley burst into the national conversation, the literary critic Lionel Trilling revealed why the nation was ripe for Buckley's high-spirited romp through its political and cultural controversies. Liberalism, Trilling declared, was not only the dominant but even the sole intellectual tradition in mid-century America, because conservatism was expressed merely in irritable mental gestures. Buckley would change that by infusing conservatism with brio, bringing elegance to its advocacy, and altering the nation's trajectory while having a grand time. Today, Will says, conservatism is soiled by scowling primitives whose irritable gestures lack mental ingredients. I want to repeat that sentence. This is the first sentence of the second paragraph in George Will's article. Today, conservatism is soiled by the scowling primitives whose irritable gestures lack mental ingredients. Unquote. What he's referring to here is, of course, today's Republican majority, more specifically, Donald Trump's base. Those who were responsible for putting Republicans into power in all three branches of government are so far away from William F. Buckley's vision of conservatism that it isn't even funny, and George Will is not laughing. Buckley brought a note of class, savoir-faire, arrogance, elitism to the conservative movement as he defined it. But the reality is, in order to get elected, in order to win at the ballot box, you had to attract other people who didn't have this position, this class, this understanding, this sense of belonging. And so, in a sense, modern conservatism has attracted the Trump base. They call themselves conservatives, But when you read and hear William Buckley, you're not talking the same language as these folks are. George Will says that today's conservatives are, quote, soiled by scowling primitives whose irritable gestures lack mental ingredients. Basically, elite conservatives are slumming in doing what they did in order to attract what we call today the Reagan Democrats in the 1980s. Read George Will, and you'll be ready for our program, at least the beginning of our program, on Monday. But right now, I think it's time for us to leave you. It's 1 minute before the top of the hour. We spent pretty much our entire 2-hour time together today on the issues of freedom of the press. In light of the mission of the Virtual Center, I don't necessarily believe that that's anything we should apologize for. I hope you'll agree. I want to thank you for being with us. I want to thank you for your continued support of Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks at Head On, and for your continued support of this program. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day on this Wednesday. I also hope that you have a wonderful rest of the week and weekend to follow. We won't be back together again until next Monday. But in the interim, I want to thank you. I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful weekend and end of the week. Be kind to each other, and thank you.